What's up, what's up, what's up? Back again. Today's video, Spirit War Boot Camp number 109. This is called 007 tubal cain. How's everyone doing? We're continuing on from our previous video. Again, I want to give a shout out to Mind Unveiled. Made another awesome video. I have this weird thing where I'll be thinking about something, like stewing on it internally. And sometimes I'll make a video and then I find out that two or more bigger creators have made related videos. And my friend Nazar helped point this out to me with the Sean Stone Tucker Carlson video. Came out about the same time as my last video, and it has a lot of the same subject matter, which is crazy to me. So we're having another one like that today with the Mind Unveiled, and he put out a video talking about the number 7. And I mean, it's a huge topic video, but he's doing kind of a Kabbalistic style decode of the Old Testament. And he hits on a very key thing, which has been pointed out to me by many people. This is something that Jason Brashears picked on, is the importance of the number 7 in the construction of the pyramid, but also the number of 7 in gematria and biblical exegesis. Like, a lot of people have pointed to that as the deadlock proof that the Bible is a math code, is the prominence of the number 7 to such an extreme statistical variance, like an 8 sigma or something like that. Like, it recurs in such a non-random way, let's put it like that. It shows that there's a profound and there was this guy Bible Wheel. I really loved his page, and he had this whole thing where he mapped the whole Old and New Testament into 7 sections, and I thought that was fucking brilliant. You know, it's, if nothing else, it's a Masonic code, because that was a lot based off the King James Bible that he had, which, as many people know, is the Rosicrucian Masonic Bible, right? And it is a math code onto the English language. But let's talk about 007. Okay, everyone thinks about James Bond 007, which is interesting. Okay, let's look at that name, James Bond. First of all, you have Jack and Boaz, Ja-Bo, as the first 2 letters of both the names. And this is not a coincidence. I've studied a lot about Ian Fleming, and he's a fascinating character. A lot of people underestimate the connection between him and Crowley, which is a big mistake. A very fascinating life. He was an occultist for sure. He studied Paracelsus and wrote essays about Paracelsus, for instance. That's one clear indicator that we have. But he used a lot of the and you know, he himself, I think his mother's maiden name is Rose Croix, for Christ's sakes. Hello, he's a Templar, you know, Fleming Bank. I happen to know because my clan of Scottish family is basically a subclade of the Fleming clan, okay? There's little different subsections of it. And both of our clans come from this guy, Lambertus Flemingi, who was the bodyguard of Jacques de Molay. Okay, you don't get much more Templar than that. It's hard to say. But anyway, and it's interesting, if you look at the original TV version of Casino Royale, which is a hilarious, fucking crazy, surreal movie, and it's kind of a comedy. The original Casino Royale, before any of the Bond films, was made as like a long TV movie, basically. Fucking crazy psychedelic fucking film. It'll blow your cat back. But anyway, in that movie, they play up this occult thing quite a bit more. Like, they make a big play of the whole Scottish thing, like Scottish Rite. Templars, you know, went to Scotland, was one of their major centers, right? And of course, you know, the Templar Navy, if you're going to have a Navy, Scotland's a pretty good fucking place to go. That's why the Vikings are fucking infested the blood pool, gene pool over there. But anyway, so Fleming's one of these families. And for that matter, so is Crowley, okay? Crowley Maritime is a huge fucking corporation that goes, it's not like people like Jack Parsons and Crowley like just happen to come into contact, okay? Both of their families are military families, involved in maritime in particular, and the occult going way back. This is the big revelation that I've had the past year that that I wanted to tell people, is that people think of like Crowley as this super eccentric dude, and like he's so out there, this and that, but it couldn't be more further from the truth. He is the establishment. He's not some radical or anything. He is the establishment. He's multi-generational military intelligence psyop Masonic dude, okay? And it's not atypical of how Masons live, okay? Like, for instance, like what I was going to say is how him and Fleming have a lot in common in terms of both being basically raised, born and bred to be diplomats and spies. They were both multilingual from a very early age. They were both literary. A lot of people don't know Peter Fleming, Ian Fleming's older brother, was also a journalist. And not just any kind of a journalist, like an ideal spy diplomat type. He traveled all over Europe at a young age with his family fortune, you know. And so so let's talk about 007 and that number. Well, some people say that Ian Fleming, one of his first published works was under a pseudonym called Teddy Legrand, and it was called Seven Heads of the Green Dragon. And I mean, I could go into a great deal of depth, but that's, if you wanted to say what's the literary origins of the concept of Spectre in the James Bond universe, like this basically Illuminati front group that's an international gangster organization. It's like supranational, like, you know, it's on every side. It's like a tentacle octopus. It's on every fucking side of every conflict. That kind of shit. But the precursor to that is in this book, Seven Heads of the Green Dragon. And so this brings us into a critical thing with the Sabbateans and their sevens. It has to do with this thing. If you go get Rigardi's book about the Golden Dawn, or any really basic introductory book about the Golden Dawn, you find this diagram that shows the tree of life with the seven Partsufim, right? This is a key thing in the Kabbalah, 7 Partsufim. It forms what's called Zer Einpin, which means the lesser countenance, or the microprosopis, right? So that's like almost, you know, like microcosm, macrocosm. So there's the small man and the great man, the small countenance and the great countenance. And the small countenance, so-called Zer Einpin, is composed of 7 Sephirot, right? And these go with the 7 planets and the 7 days of the week. And it goes along with the Chaldean planetary system, far predating. It's basically what you would call Canaanite / Babylonian, you know, astrotheology, right? It's far predating anything that we're calling biblical, right? And the Egyptians and Babylonians had the same thing, right? So at any rate, what is this about? How does this carry on from our previous video? Well, of course, the Masons are Sabbateans by nature, okay? It's because it is a Kabbalistic thing, and all Judaism is based on the goat god Saturn, star of Remphan, Saturn, the 6, you know, the hexagram, the hexagon, the cube, like all those things are connected in the system, and it all pertains to Saturn, the goat god, and the basic like bacchanalian god. That's why Jeffrey Epstein at his big New York mansion has a fucking bust of fucking, or a head of Bacchus on his fucking door, dude. You know, that's not an accident. And where is it? It's straight down the street from the St. James Church, right? Again, James being the Scottish version is Jacobus, right? Jacobus, right? The one who seizes the heel of Esau, you know. But St. James and St. Jacob are both associated. Iacchus and Bacchus, right? So these are both Saturnine entities, right? And they're what we think of as bacchanalia is like orgies, basically wine and drug induced orgies going back to the ancient world. And they're violent. It's not like a fun sexy time. It's like rape and violence and murder and bloodshed and fucking blood drinking. The Bacchus, of course, being the god of the wine, which is a symbol for the adrenalized blood. Okay, people don't want to think about all this shit, but this is what the Masons are. Okay, that's why they have the G as their symbol, which is and that's also composed of the square, which is, you know, 4 sides, and the compass, which is a triangle of 3 sides. So 4 plus 3 being 7. Hello. And then the letter G is the 7th letter of the alphabet. And it stands for Gaionum, which has, or galutes, right? Or what do you call the exilarchy. So they had this thing called the Gaionum and the exilarchy, which was the, you know, the Judaic, you know, Sabbateans after they were kicked out of Babylon, or in diaspora from Babylon. They were called exilarchs. Okay, it's, you know, it's a super deep. And I could go all into that. And so this connects into, okay, so the Babylonian exilarchs basically were all up in the Roman Empire and prior, of course. But after the Roman Empire, they became the nobility families, especially of southern France and Spain, called the Gaonum. It just happens as a bizarre coincidence that my 33rd great-grandfather was one of these so-called Babylonian exilarchs, and also our third president, that Masonic 3, the third president, Thomas Jefferson, is direct descendant through his mother's Randolph lineage from this fucking Rennes-le-Chateau Sabbatean exilarchs, okay? And that's why a lot of people have correctly deciphered the fact that Thomas Jefferson was Mr. Illuminati. He was the guy. So I mean Franklin too, same. They were Sabbateans, okay? They were really into the wine, right? And the fucking Jefferson almost went bankrupt with all the French wine that he bought, of course, being ambassador to France, like I'm saying. And this goes back to what we call the GOL, the GOL for Grand Orient Lodge, Freemasonry coming out of France, the Nine Sisters Lodge, okay? So this is super clutch to having a realistic understanding of not only our government, but the pseudo-religions that established that government, which are nothing but a rehash of the Roman civic religion with their Pontifex Maximus, which we now call the Pope. It's no fucking different, Anyway. So anyway, the point is, these families and these bloodlines, they're all carrying forward this Sabbatean thing, and we don't particularly think of them as being like Judaic or whatever, but they're Masonic, and they're from selected bloodlines that go back to these Merovingians and others, and the Rose Croix, if you're Ian Fleming, like you're all up in that shit on both sides. It's a genetic thing for them. And so these Sabbateans, they have the number 7 as their thing, G, the letter G, the generative organs, the Gaonum. All of these things are connecting in. But most importantly, it relates to, like I was saying, the Partsufim. So getting back to that, just like we have 7 major archangels in the angelology of conventional Judeo-Christian, theology, we have 7 major archangels. And we have 7 archons, right? The light side and the dark side of the same thing. The archons would be like a lot of times thought of in terms of the 7 deadly sins and so on. But as I was saying, in the Golden Dawn, of course, we have this thing, the diagram that I was talking about, where you show the 7 Sephirot of the Partsufim and of the Zer Einpin, right, which represents the 7 planets. And so those 7 can become the host of a virtue or a vice. They can either lead you to enlightenment, or they can cause you not only your demise, but kind of this contagion of parasitism that spreads through your words, speech, and actions out into the world. Words, thought, and actions. Sorry, but my point is to say, they're teaching you all this stuff. If you read their books and you look at their systems, they teach you so much. And that's kind of their karmic out. That's the way they avoid any negative impact of their actions, because they're like, well, we told them. We put it all right in their face, But why is any of this relevant? Okay, but like I was saying in the previous video, talking about possession and the centrality of possession, mediumism, and so on, and these non-corporeal intelligences. So this goes all up into the Kabbalah, dealing with stuff like Lilith, with Samael Lilith, and how there's 2, in the first 7 generations down from Adam, there's 2 sides of the tree, right? There's all these names that sound so similar. There's Methuselah and Methusael. There's 2 Enochs, right? There's Jared and Irad, right? There's I can't remember all of them, but there's like 7 twins at the very beginning. And again, coming back to the Sabbateanism, the cycle of 7s, the Saturnian cult of the Bacchanalia, right? And of course, to this day, people look over all the things like the fact that our new year that starts our whole civil calendar of everything our whole society is based on is a Sabbatean calendar, okay? That's why the Saturn planet, the Saturn planets are at the end. They used to call it the Saturnalia. What we have and call Christmas right now is about a human sacrifice scapegoat called the Lord of Misrule, it's a slave who gets to become king for 7 days, and they either then put him into exile out of the city or kill him at the end of it, sacrifice him, right? That's the Bacchanalia, and we call that Christmas. We call that Christmas and New Year's. It's really the Saturnalia. And just as the Saturnalia was a 7-day period, have you ever noticed there's exactly 7 days, including Christmas and New Year? You never thought about that? Our whole society is based on the Sabbatean geometry, the Sabbatean religions, which comprises, in my mind, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They're all Sabbatean religions. They're all based on pedophilia, the bacchanalia, right? Saturnism. That's the reality. And we're given this false dichotomy like, oh, Jesus versus Satanism. Where did Satan come from? He's in the Bible. That's where he was created. He was created by the Judeo-Sabbateans in their holy book. And of course, you know, then the Islamic, which is just Arabic flavor of the same thing, the Babylonian cult, and Christianity is the Roman version of the same thing. And they, you know, it's only very slightly altered from Mithraism. And you could see that to this day of how, you know, our whole government and the is run by this military cult called Christianity. Like, that's the whole operating system of our fucking society, okay? And it's based on this Sabbatean cult. People look at the front organizations like the Catholic Church or the Protestants or whatever, or Islam, you know, they look at all that stuff and they don't realize that really all of that is one big system of the Bacchanalia and the Sabbateanism. And just like they have the 7 days of the week and the 7 Chaldean planets, they have the 7 holy virtues and the 7 deadly sins. And so what they're doing with all these entities, right, these daemones, or whatnot, these non-corporeal energies and intelligences that sway and influence human behavior into vice. So if you're a Sabbatean, and you're really good, really true to the doctrine of what they believe, you would be like both a Christian minister and like the Pornhub, the rabbi that owns Pornhub. That's real. That's a real thing. And OnlyFans. So it's all these Sabbateans, you know. While they're doing that, while they're corrupting our entire society with vice, corruption, drug abuse, mental illness, you know, AI, fucking nanotech, right? It's neural lace and everything. They're doing all that, but they're posing as the moral authority all the while, and as the virtuous, good shepherd. That's like, this is the reality of the Sabbatean cult that we live in, okay? And a good student like myself, or someone who's following all these threads and knows that there's fuckery afoot all along the way, like, at a certain point, like, everyone has their little point. Every real true conspiracist has their point where they break through it. And mine was really early in high school. Of course, the year I graduated, I think, was the year that JFK film came out by Oliver Stone. And it was before I even knew the existence of that movie. I was doing my, you know, junior year term paper on that topic, right? And that was, once I started looking into that, and I'm like, holy shit, the Zios, the CIA, the Jesuits, like all these groups, like converging, and the mafia, like converging with this one common ritualistic murder going. The Sabbatean cult. They always have a scapegoat, like Charlie Kirk, who I don't think is dead, by the way. What one bit do I think that guy is actually dead? And I do not think that he was somehow surprised to find out that his bride was a fucking handler. I think anybody with one brain cell to rub together would know that right off the bat. She's not exactly a good actress, okay? She doesn't hide her wickedness at one degree. Like, there's nobody can convince me that he was like, oh, I'm a virtuous Christian, and I'm just surprised when this Mossad operative comes and takes my life over and seizes control. Like, that wasn't a surprising, like, thing that happened. It's like, if you couldn't see that coming 100 miles away, like, you've got some kind of mental problems anyway. But the same, I can't believe that there's people out there that are still going to Turning Point events and think that this is reality based of at face value type of presentation. No fucking way. And why does any of that all become possible is the fact that we're ruled by these Sabbateans. So let's look at 007, and let's look at the name James Bond. Well, first of all, James Bond was the name of an ornithologist, and in fact, in one of the Pierce Brosnan James Bonds, he's carrying the book of bird watching by James Bond. So that's kind of interesting. So anyway, but that name, like I said, pertains to Jachin and Boaz, and it has to also do, like, Bond. When you think Bond, that's like two things are attracting each other. Now, interestingly, Ian Fleming's father was called Valentine, which is where we get the word valence in chemistry, which is the chemical attraction between two oppositely charged ions, right? That's valence. That's the force of attraction and strength. That's also a very Gnostic thing pertaining to the erotic nature of Gnosticism. But and so when we're talking 007, what we're really talking about is tubal cain. And some people may not know this whole concept of tubal cain, but if you read the Masonic lore, they call themselves the sons of Cain quite openly. And as we're talking about with all this Kabbalah, the sons of Cain are the heirs of the serpent. Okay, there's two different races going on, and this is why at that Trementina base I was telling you about and Zorro Ranch area, they got these two little overlapping circles. It represents the battle between the two bloodlines, the black squares and the white squares, and just how, and also what they want is they want this state of mediumism and possession, where it's like one entity kind of gets shut off or leaves the body, projects out of the body, and another entity comes in and replaces it. Okay, now some people would connect this with the idea of remote viewing, and all these guys, these former Scientology guys that were really into, they call it in Scientology, they call it exteriorization. Like if you really believe that you're an operating thetan, like one of the proofs of that is that your sensorium and your consciousness can operate independent of the physical body. And that's what remote viewing is. Nor is this anything new. Like when I was very first into all this stuff, I learned about astral projection quite early on. And in my opinion, it's highly connected into this deal of like lucid dreaming and stuff. Like they're very closely related phenomena. But anyway, so this is something that all these groups are very interested in, and they've been engaged. And so what is the better modality for spying than that? Like you don't have to buy a boat, you don't have to have a helicopter, you don't have to go behind enemy lines and like risk life and limb. Like you gain information. That's what John Dee was doing with his Enochian workings. That's what James Bond and any real spy, like of any real power, would obviously pursue that as the most, conventional way of doing things. And so the reason why he's called 007 has to do with this tubal cain. And in Masonry, they have the symbol of tubal cain, which is basically a cane with two balls. And the cane itself is represented in the shape of a number 7. Okay? And this again is pertaining to these 7 archons, which can infest and inhabit the human body and turn the person to vice and turn them to corruption and destruction and lead to their occupation of their physical body. Their tree of life is occupied by these vice lords, if you will, right? These archons. And which is what's fascinating to me is that even in Far East Asia and China and Taoism and so on, they have the exact same concept. They call it Hun and Po. There's 3, just like the tree of life has the 3 supernal sephira. We have the 3 Hun or Hun spirits in Chinese, and they leave the body. They're immortal. They don't die with the body. The body has 7 spirits called Po that try to re-enter the ground and pull your bones back into the ground. So these are 7 terrestrial spirits that are obsessed with materialism and vice, right? And so what the Sabbateans do is they keep humanity enslaved to these vices. And not only that, but they profit on it because they know that a person who's acting by vice is not using reason and logic. They are not acting in their own self-interest. They are not improving themselves, strengthening themselves, educating themselves, because all their energy is dissipated through vice, which is an entropic force. And so that's why they use the number 7. That's why all the Masons got the little square and compass and the G. It's like a double symbolic representation of a 7, because they're projecting out this archontic influence into the world. What are the archons? They're called the architects of this world. That's why the Masons are called, they worship the great architect of the universe, which in reality is what? The demiurgos, right? So architect doesn't create buildings. He assembles them, and he maybe can fabricate materials, but he's not creating that out of scratch, right? He's taking something that already exists in the world. So that's where we get the word demiurgos. So demi in modern French means half of something, right? So a demiurge or demiurgos, refers to work and effort. So in a way, demiurgos means half the effort, right? But the demiurge, his characteristic is that he poses as the creator, right? So he only does half the work, but yet he takes credit and poses as the creator. And just like the sun in the sky, or Apollyon, when the sun is out, you can't see any of the other 7 planets most of the time. There's some rare occasions close to dawn or sunset where you could see Venus, for instance, but that might be the only one that can do that because it's bright enough. But the point is, you know, the demiurgos of Apollyon, he hides all the other planets and says, I am the one true God. You know what I mean? But in reality, like, there's the sun behind the sun. Even the ancient Egyptians thought that, you know? So the point is, the demiurgos is trying to keep you rooted into the material world of impermanence and vice. What are all the vices? The vices are a delusional obsession with the fruits of materiality, and they cause us to crave things that are fleeting and impermanent, and to create a permanent sense of dissatisfaction, discomfort, and restlessness. Okay, this is what the Sabbateans do. So if you want to beat them, you cultivate the 7 virtues. You cultivate your Sephirot. You learn about the planetary forces, at least on a metaphorical basis, right? Now, for instance, another parallel with the Far East is in China. They say that all the emotional afflictions, right, anger, lust, fear, you know, and so forth, these things are all diseases, and they generate disease. And there's certain specific types of illness that are produced by, say, grief, anger, even joy. Even joy is considered as a vice and a potentially disease-causing imbalance, right? And there's exactly 7, right? So that's kind of interesting idea to think about, is the fact that you have something like acupuncture, Chinese medicine, and Taoism, right, all having the same exact schematic of a 3/7 governing the human microcosm as well as the celestial macrocosm. So that's something to contemplate, right? And in my opinion, when I see things like that are just echoes through every single culture on earth, like the idea of demonic possession, for instance, right? And the idea that there's malevolent entities that can influence human life and our conduct and potentially modify our behavior and our perceptions, right? There's a basis for that. You know, you don't have to necessarily fully like anthropomorphize it and think of like some human-shaped malevolent, you know, thing that's similar to a human, because it's not really like that at all. But I would say that it's almost like an energetic subroutine in the body. If you think about addictions, like people that are obese and stuff, and they have an eating disorder or whatnot, you know, or anything, or alcoholism or whatever, smoking too much weed, right? Having habitual, non-functional, dysfunctional behavioral patterns that do not produce intelligence, success, and, you know, competency, and like this, that's samsaric, if you will, in the Buddhist context. And so in a lot of the in the Vedic and Buddhist systems, they have 7 chakras, which is closely related. Interestingly, you can map the 7 endocrine glands onto these different chakras in a variety of ways, you know. And so there's something there. And of course, you know, hormones influence our perceptions. Like, and if a person's got an adrenal response, they get in this flight or fight mode, they kind of tighten up, they kind of become a little bit paranoid and reactive, for instance. Or, you know, like if you have testosterone or estrogen, that's going to influence your behavior and your perceptions in a certain way. So these are deep lessons that we can learn by watching the movements of the enemy. And we can learn, once we learn their methodology, their worldview, right? They adhere to their worldview. So much of all the magic that they do and the power that they work and the influence that they have on society is based on their rigid adherence to their worldview and their use of their worldview schematic to create real world outer effects, right? That's what they do. So by learning that, by learning their techniques and procedures, we can defend and we can form a counter strategy against that. But the simplest counter strategy is outlined, of course, by the Buddha in his Eightfold Noble Path. And things like dharana and samadhi, right? The ability to keep the mind focused on a desired schematic and our desired outcomes and our desired modes of conduct. Like, all you have to do is that, right? That in itself conquers all the 7 vices. Like, you're never going to be corrupted if you have samadhi and you're staying in samadhi. You're staying focused. You have the proper aspiration for your life. You know what the purpose of it is. And you know the means to achieve that purpose. And so you'd never become distracted. And so Pornhub and fucking OnlyFans and whatever it is, or the U.S. military, like, has no power to deflect you from your true state of being, right? But if you get caught in their simulation, if the architect of the Matrix calls you into his office and he projects on screens all these false realities of the Platonic cave projections of the Chaldean archontic planetary influences into your world, creating illusions, like, if you're not wise to that, if you don't see that and you don't discern the methodology behind it, you are going to be trapped in a cave of illusion, and you're going to be perpetuating your own suffering after cycle after cycle. So by learning the methods of the enemy and their systematic protocols of conduct and their worldview, we can identify their schemes, subvert their schemes, or even make them our bitch and make them and all their effort basically work to produce our benefit. This is actually possible with a sufficient degree of understanding. And that's where I'm trying to get us all. And this has been Spirit War number 109. Hope you're doing great. We'll see you next time.